It's an emotional scene. A young man supporting his friend through one of the worst moments of his life. Cameras capture the grief, the pain, and the weight of a loss that's too heavy to carry alone. To anyone watching, it was heartbreaking. A glimpse into raw, human suffering. And at first glance, it's easy to understand why this image feels so disturbing. But the real reason is something far worse. To understand how this moment happened, we first need to talk about Fernanda. Fernanda Damaris Maciel Correa was born on May 9, 1996, in Independencia, Santiago, Chile. Her childhood wasn't perfect. When she was just 3 years old, her parents split up, and Fernanda moved with her mother and siblings to a new town called Conchalí. At first, she adapted well. She did fine in school, stayed close with her father, and was known for being cheerful and full of life. But that didn't last. As Fernanda grew older, something inside her started to change. By her teenage years, the anger had set in. She fought constantly with her classmates, her siblings, even her mother. School counselors tried to help. Interventions were made. Nothing worked. In 2007, she was sent to a home for at-risk minors. But by the time she came back, things were even worse. Fernanda started disappearing for long stretches, wandering the streets with groups of teenagers deep into addiction. She called them her friends, and over time, their habits became hers. Fernanda's relationship with her family had broken down almost completely. Most nights, she stayed out late, drinking, distancing herself from the people still trying to help. And when they did try, it usually ended in shouting. After barely finishing high school, she took a job as a hostess at a local nightclub, a place that only made things worse. The customers, the hours, the lifestyle, all of it pushed her further into the habits she was already struggling with. But slowly, things began to shift. She entered a new relationship, this time with a 36-year-old taxi driver. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. Her mother liked him. He was patient, and with time, Fernanda started leaving old habits behind. She quit the nightclub and found work as a waitress at a restaurant, something steadier, quieter. And when she found out she was pregnant, it became clear just how far she had come. Because for the first time in years, Fernanda wasn't thinking about how to escape her life. She was trying to build one. And then, just as things were starting to fall into place, she disappeared. On February 10th, 2018, Fernanda went to a beauty salon with one of her neighbors. After the appointment, she was dropped off near her home just before noon. But this was the last time anyone ever saw her. She never made it back inside her house. When she didn't return that night, her mother and her boyfriend went to the police to report her missing. At first, the case didn't seem like an emergency. With no clear signs of a crime, Fernanda's disappearance was treated like a standard missing person case. Posters were put up around the neighborhood, notices posted online, and officers canvassed the streets asking if anyone had seen her. Early suspicions fell on a taxi driver who had regularly picked Fernanda up. Friends told police that he had been harassing her, even offering her baby clothes and pushing for her number. When confronted, the driver lied, claiming Fernanda had asked for his number first. Eventually, he admitted the truth. He had met Fernanda years earlier at a nightclub and had become obsessed with her. But even after a full forensic search of his car, police found no evidence tying him to her disappearance. Even Fernanda's boyfriend came under suspicion. Friends told police about a recent argument between the two, and there were rumors of abuse. But after a full investigation, he too was ruled out. As the official investigation stalled, Fernanda's family took matters into their own hands. They poured through hours of surveillance footage, trying to find anything the police had missed. And eventually, they did. One piece of footage caught Fernanda walking toward a warehouse just a few meters from her home. The warehouse owned and operated by Felipe Rojas, her neighbor and friend of 10 years. And in the days following her disappearance, he had been on TV, standing in front of news crews, pleading for her safe return. When investigators dug deeper, they found that Felipe had invited Fernanda to smoke marijuana the day she disappeared. He denied they ever met up, claiming she ignored the invitation. Despite this, police raided his warehouse 5 times, turning up nothing. With no hard evidence, Felipe remained free. But that was until May 2019, when Fernanda's mother begged authorities to search the warehouse one more time. A new camera angle showed someone carrying bags of cement around the time Fernanda vanished. It wasn't enough for an arrest. But then, a break came from the last person anyone expected, Felipe's ex-girlfriend. In June 2019, she told police that Felipe had confessed everything to her. Through tears, he had told her that Fernanda slipped, hit her head, and died while he was too high to react. He said he panicked, wrapped her body in cloth, and buried her under garbage and cement in the back of the warehouse. Following her statement, investigators dug into the floor once again. This time, they didn't stop. Beneath piles of buried trash, they found a concrete slab, and hidden under that slab was a shallow grave filled with lime and dust. As they sifted through the powder, a white sneaker appeared, the same shoes Fernanda had been wearing the day she disappeared. Beneath it, they uncovered a partially mummified body curled into a fetal position. Fernanda, still carrying her unborn child. Felipe was arrested the same day, caught live on television at a shopping centre. But the horror didn't end with his arrest. An autopsy revealed that Felipe's confession to his ex-girlfriend had been a lie. There was no head trauma. Fernanda's hyoid bone was broken, meaning she had been strangled. And when confronted again, Felipe finally told the full truth. On February 10th, 2018, Felipe invited Fernanda to the warehouse under the guise of a casual night of smoking. But at some point, he took a photo of Fernanda's legs, and something inside him snapped. When Fernanda said she was going to leave, Felipe lunged, grabbing her by the neck and dragging her inside. He strangled her until she was unconscious, then assaulted her while she lay helpless. Afterward, he tied her up, wrapped her body in fabric, and buried her in a garbage pit behind the warehouse. But Fernanda wasn't dead. She was still alive when Felipe covered her body in cement and sealed her underground. And as Fernanda's family searched, as her boyfriend mourned on television, as strangers handed out flyers with her face printed across them, Felipe stood beside them, comforting them, supporting them, playing the role of the devastated friend, while the girl he murdered was buried just meters away. After his arrest, Felipe continued to lie, shifting his story again and again. But eventually, the evidence was too overwhelming to deny. On April 11th, 2023, he was found guilty of Fernanda's murder. 2 weeks later, he was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after 40 years. When he stood up to speak, he gave a single sentence of apology. He never even said Fernanda's name. Nobody believed him. Nobody cared. It took nearly 2 years for Fernanda Maciel to be found and finally laid to rest. 2 years of silence, 2 years of searching, while the man responsible stayed close enough to be in nearly every frame. And that's what makes the image so much worse. A man holding up his broken friend, captured in a moment of grief. But what the cameras didn't see was that the man comforting him was the one who ended her life.
We'll return after these messages.
Every day, your personal information is collected and sold without you even knowing. Your name, phone number, home address, and online accounts, all traded between companies called data brokers. They make billions selling your data to marketers, scammers, and worse. And while they're legally required to remove it if you ask, they make that process deliberately difficult. That's where today's sponsor, Aura, comes in. Aura is an all-in-one digital security solution that helps protect your identity, accounts, and devices. It scans the dark web and public records for your personal info and sends fast alerts if anything is found. It also includes real-time fraud monitoring, a secure VPN, antivirus, and password manager all in one app. And if something does go wrong, you get 24/7 support and up to $5 million in identity theft protection. You can try Aura free for 14 days by visiting aura.com/thevoid or clicking the link in the description or pinned comment. In that time, you'll see exactly where your information is exposed and how far it's already spread. Your data may already be out there. The only question is, who has it now? This next one is slightly different. It isn't an image in the traditional sense, but rather a photocopy. Something you might find in the margins of a journal no one was ever meant to read. But the longer you stare, the more it starts to feel like something else. Like, this wasn't just art. It was a mapping of someone's mind, a glimpse into the chaos, the delusion, and something far more disturbing beneath it all. This is the revelations of a schizophrenic. Behind the strange cover and the confused sketches was a real world, one far darker than anything the drawings could show. It started with 3 people. Jorge Beltrão Negromonte da Silveira, born to Portuguese immigrants, grew up between Portugal and Brazil. His early life already hinted at violence. As a teenager, he was accused of killing another boy, but walked free due to a lack of evidence. Later, he attacked his own mother, stole her life savings, and disappeared into obscurity. In 1984, Jorge married Isabel Cristina Torreão Pires da Silveira, a woman who had grown up poor, isolated, and deeply religious. Their wedding reception ended in violence when Jorge threatened to kill their guests with a knife. From that moment on, they lived in near total isolation, drifting further and further from the world around them. Years later, Jorge met Bruna Cristina Oliveira da Silva, a 16-year-old girl from a broken home. He was her gym teacher. He was married. But within months, Bruna was living with Jorge and Isabel as part of a self-made family, a love triangle built on secrecy, control, and a growing disconnection from reality. Together, they formed a closed circle, and in the isolation of that life, a new belief took hold. He believed he had been chosen for something greater, a mission to purify the world, even claiming he heard the voices of an angel and a cherub, which he obeyed. He called their group the Cartel, and according to Jorge, their purpose was simple: to stop overpopulation, to cleanse the earth, and to open a portal to paradise, a gateway they believed could only be unlocked through sacrifice. What they did to try and reach that paradise would soon shock an entire country. Their first known victim was 17-year-old Jessica Camila da Silva Pereira. In May of 2008, they invited her to their home under the promise of help. Jessica was homeless, carrying her 1-year-old daughter in her arms, and she had nowhere else to go. While she was distracted, one of them struck her on the head. As she stumbled, they dragged her into the bathroom and cut her throat, draining her blood. When it was over, they cut up her body and carefully sliced the meat to be stored overnight in a refrigerator. The next day, the pieces were seasoned with salt and cumin, grilled and eaten. Some of it was even fed to her 1-year-old daughter. The rest of Jessica's remains were buried in the backyard, arranged into the shape of a cross, while other body fragments were thrown into the trash. But they didn't stop there. Over the next few years, the trio moved from city to city, taking the child with them. They passed through Conde, Jaboatão dos Guararapes, and Gravatá before settling in Garanhuns. And there, in 2012, the killings resumed. In February, they abducted and murdered 31-year-old Gisele Helena da Silva. Just a month later, they killed 20-year-old Alexandra da Silva Falcão. Both women were lured in the same way: promises of work, promises of help, and when they accepted, they were slaughtered. The flesh was cut away, seasoned, and used to make savory pastries. The pastries were sold to neighbors, to beauty salons, to people who had no idea what they were eating. None of them knew the truth. Behind it all was the same belief that had guided them from the beginning, that killing these women and consuming their flesh was a sacred act, a purification, a step closer to the portal they thought would carry them into paradise. But eventually, the bodies they tried so hard to hide would come back to expose everything. Shortly after Gisele Helena da Silva went missing, her family began looking through her accounts. What they found were purchases made in Garanhuns, long after she should have been gone. Investigators pulled the security footage from the stores and quickly identified Jorge, Isabel, and Bruna making the transactions. On April 9, 2012, police arrived at their home with arrest warrants. What they found inside was worse than anything they had expected. Jessica da Silva's 5-year-old daughter, who had been living with the trio since her mother's death, told officers that her father had killed women in the house and buried their bodies nearby. It didn't take long for one of the suspects to break. They confessed, leading officers to the backyard where the bodies had been hidden. Buried shallow in the dirt, investigators found human remains, hacked apart and disfigured beyond recognition. The house was immediately vandalized by furious neighbors and eventually set on fire, but the evidence was already clear. DNA confirmed the identities of the victims, and the full horror of what the trio had done spread through Brazil. On November 14, 2014, Jorge, Isabel, and Bruna were convicted of the murder of Jessica da Silva. Jorge was sentenced to 21 years, Isabel and Bruna to 19. Later, in 2018, all three were convicted again for the murders of Gisele and Alexandra, with sentences ranging from 68 to 71 years. In 2019, their punishments were increased even further, ensuring none of them would ever be free again. The rest of their victims' remains were quietly recovered and buried properly. But even after the bodies were buried and the case was closed, something else remained. A final piece of evidence that offered a glimpse into the mind behind it all. While awaiting trial under psychiatric care, Jorge Negromonte began writing. With the help of mental health workers, he produced a book titled Revelations of a Schizophrenic. The book spans 34 short chapters, mixing memories, hallucinations, violent confessions, and strange, poetic ramblings. Some chapters describe his childhood, others recount the visions he believed led him to kill. Scattered throughout are crude drawings, distorted figures, masked faces, and scenes of violence that reflected the nightmares he carried with him. It was self-published through a notary's office and eventually leaked online, giving the world an unfiltered look inside the mind of a man who believed his crimes were part of a divine mission. Today, Jorge remains under psychiatric care. He has written 3 more books and now claims to live as an ovo-lacto vegetarian. Maria, the little girl they stole after murdering her mother, is alive and living under a new identity, now removed from the horror she once lived. Looking back at the cover of Revelations of a Schizophrenic, you're not just seeing scribbles and sketches. You're looking at a map of a killer's mind, and every nightmare it made real. In the middle of a cluttered room sits what looks like an oversized doll, dressed in a red hoodie pulled tight over its head and a denim skirt hanging stiff around its waist. The limbs look off, too bulky, too rigid, covered in thick stockings and gloves. And then there's the face, pale, glossy, and frozen. The eyes look painted on, but not in a way that was ever meant to be seen up close. At first glance, it's easy to assume that this is nothing more than a homemade toy. But the truth behind this so-called doll is far darker than anyone could have expected. Anatoly Moskvin was never a normal kid. Growing up in the Russian city of Gorky, he spent his days wandering through graveyards, exploring abandoned cemeteries with the few friends he had. But what truly set him apart was something much darker. When he was just 13 years old, Anatoly claimed that a group of strangers dragged him into the funeral of an 11-year-old girl. They didn't just make him watch. They forced him to lean over her body and kiss her cold, waxy forehead. After that day, death became something different to him, something he couldn't seem to let go of. Despite it all, Anatoly built a life that, on the surface, seemed completely normal. He graduated from Moscow State University, became a respected linguist and historian, and spoke 13 languages fluently. His colleagues described him as a genius. A little odd maybe, but harmless. Behind the scenes, though, things were much stranger. Anatoly's obsession with cemeteries grew. He spent years walking through hundreds of graveyards across his city, recording names, studying burial rituals, and sleeping in abandoned coffins. He even called himself a necropolis, a self-proclaimed expert on the dead. But even with all of his knowledge, even with all of his credentials, nobody realized what he was really doing out there. And when the truth finally came out, it shocked the world. In 2009, people across Nizhny Novgorod started noticing something strange. Graves were being disturbed. Some had been dug up entirely, the earth overturned, the coffins left open. At first, police believed it was the work of extremists. They beefed up patrols, sent their best detectives to investigate, but for 2 years, nothing. Graves kept getting desecrated. Families kept finding their loved ones' resting places ruined, and no one had any idea why. It wasn't until 2011 that investigators got a real lead. Reports came in that Muslim graves were being vandalized, and police traced the acts back to a single man, Anatoly Moskvin. When officers entered his home, they weren't sure what to expect. But what they found was something nobody could have prepared for. Inside, squeezed between towering piles of books, newspapers, and clutter, were dozens of life-sized dolls, some sitting neatly on sofas, others propped up on shelves or tucked behind curtains. At first, they just looked strange. Their clothes were worn, and many of them looked crudely assembled, like someone had tried and failed to make toys by hand. But there was a smell in the apartment, something rotten, buried beneath layers of dust and old paper. And when detectives looked closer, they realized the truth. These weren't dolls at all. They were corpses. Moskvin had spent years exhuming the bodies of young girls from cemeteries across the region, girls as young as 3 years old. He dried their bodies using salt and baking soda, stuffed their hollow forms with rags, and dressed them in stockings, frilly dresses, and children's clothing. Some had wax masks molded over their faces. Others had toy eyes placed in their empty sockets so they could watch cartoons with him. He named them. He celebrated their birthdays. He even buried music boxes inside their chests so that when he touched them, they would play music. Footage from the investigation showed the dolls packed into every corner of the apartment. Some seated at the dinner table, some shoved into cracks in the walls. One was dressed like a teddy bear. And somehow, through all of it, Moskvin's parents, who lived in the very same apartment, claimed they thought they were just dolls. In total, police discovered 29 mummified girls inside Moskvin's home, one corpse he kept for nearly 9 years. But judging by the evidence they found, the maps, the gravestone plaques, the instructions for making the dolls, the real number of desecrated graves may have been as high as 150. When confronted, Anatoly Moskvin showed no remorse. In court, he told the victims' families that they had no right to their daughters anymore, that when they buried them, they gave them up, and he refused to apologize. Because in his mind, these weren't victims, they were his children. Anatoly Moskvin was arrested and charged with the desecration of graves and dead bodies, a crime that carried a maximum sentence of just 5 years in prison. When psychiatrists evaluated him, they diagnosed Moskvin with paranoid schizophrenia. In 2012, a Russian court ruled that he was unfit to stand trial. Instead of going to prison, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital, where he would remain indefinitely. Every year, his case would be reviewed. Every year, doctors would decide whether he was safe enough to be released. And year after year, Moskvin stayed exactly where he was. Over time, though, his doctors began to change their minds. In 2018, they petitioned the court to release him to outpatient care, claiming he was no longer dangerous. But after a second evaluation, that request was denied. The truth was that even after all those years, Moskvin showed no remorse. Moskvin explained that he had acted out of loneliness, that he had always wanted children, but had been denied adoption because of his low income. He claimed that the dead girls were calling out to him, begging to be rescued from their graves. And in his own twisted way, he believed he was saving them, keeping them safe, waiting for the day when science would find a way to bring them back to life. Today, Anatoly Moskvin remains confined inside a psychiatric hospital. The dolls he built, though, the ones dressed in children's clothes and hidden in every corner of his crumbling apartment, became something else entirely once the truth came out. Because when you see their glossy faces, their slumped bodies wrapped in layers of fabric, it's easy to convince yourself it's nothing more than a toy. But beneath the fabric and makeup was a child whose death wasn't the end, only the beginning of something far worse.